Hi, welcome back to week 2 of Tefila Prayer as Life Practice. This week's learning session is titled Lifelong Spiritual Practices. And in particular, I would note that these are in relation to Tefillah. Again, my name is Hillel Broder, and I'm very excited about what's happening so far in our module. The conversations that have been happening have been really interesting, and I do hope that we continue learning together over the next week or so. Please be in touch with any questions, concerns, and I would love to hear your own thoughts. I feel like whatever happens with tefillah, it always really kind of strikes a very kind of primal, deep chord in one's own being. So we're going to explore two kinds of contemplative practices this week. The first is really writing practices. The second is body practices. The writing practices are ways in which students can reflect on their own being, on their own progress through tefillah in the context of tefillah. And I borrow practices here from contemporary thinkers about writing, including my own thoughts about writing. But I really want to base my thinking on this very small paragraph, but very kind of crucial moment in Mesilat Yesharim, the third chapter, which is a chapter on watchfulness, on Zehirut, where the Ramchal writes, "V'hinini ro'et tzorech la'adam she'eh medakdek v'shokel d'rachav dvar yom v'yomo." So he says that really a person must be precise and weigh his ways. He should check his ways every single day. Like merchants, the great, really successful merchants who are very precise and very careful with their merchandise. And one should set times and hours and regular routines for this so that it's not just sort of a happenstance thing. It doesn't happen at a random time in a sort of unfixed or maybe sort of special time, but again, in an unfixed or unroutinized way. Ella bikfiut gadol, right? It should happen in a routine way. It should happen in a regular way. Kirov hatoladahi, because there will be great production from such a practice. So the Ramchal here sort of promises, and actually the truth is this entire parak of Mesilat Yesharim, the third parak, is dedicated to this kind of practice, but he promises that this is crucial for developing an awareness of one's own flaws and one's own tefillot and one's own hopes. So let's start by taking a look here at the structure of a paradigm for thinking through tefillah. So Anne Lamott wrote a book, I think last year or 2 years ago, called Help, Thanks, Wow. And I think it's important to stress that our tefillot are essentially built around this practice. She argues that prayer is essentially 3 types of gestures, 3 types of utterances: asking for help for something, being grateful for something, and being in awe for something. And what she recommends as a practice is that every day a person ask for help, be thankful, and be in awe. And I think what's important to discuss with students is that our tefillah structure, no matter how you slice it, is built around a similar affect, or cultivating similar sentiments. So you have brachot, you have berachot hashachar, where you are thankful, moda'ani, you are thankful, you are in awe, in psukei de zimra. You create a relationship through awe and through gratitude in Birchot Kriyat Shema, and then your Shemona Esrei here as a structure to end really cultivates all elements, right? That you are both, you're in awe at the very beginning of Shemona Esrei, you ask for particular kinds of help in the middle of Shemona Esrei, and then you are thankful, Hoda'ah, at the very end of Shemona Esrei. It might be helpful, this might be a great practice if you were to incorporate a prayer journal that every day students would write down a single tefillah on each of these registers. And I would argue that you should feel free to change the order, right? Perhaps, I personally prefer wow, help, thanks based on the structure of our tefillah, and I think it would be great to include this practice as maybe an opening practice or a closing practice for a regular tefillah setting. Morning pages. Morning pages is a little less structured than Help, Thanks, Wow. The theory of morning pages comes from this book called The Artist's Way by Julia Cameron, where she just suggests that every morning one write somewhere between 1 to 3 pages. Now, one should not second guess, one should just follow the stream of consciousness, and she argues that in doing so, over the course of 12 weeks or so, one sees real changes not only in thinking, but in behavior, because writing every day allows one to cut through the static of one's own thinking, to gain perspective on the loops and the progress of one's own being. One can track, progress in that sense. With students, I would recommend that you might start with prompts to guide them in a way. If you actually purchase this book, there are some excellent prompts in the book itself, but I imagine you can come up with certain prompts that are Tefillah specific as well. Perhaps topics, right? Not just prompts, but something a little more general. So topics, maybe being thankful for something, or gratitude or awe. And then you could probably move to just no prompts at all and have students, just be writing about their innermost thoughts about whatever's happening at the moment. I think it's important to stress that writing in this sense is a process, and that there's less focus on the product, that the students don't need to share this with anyone. It doesn't need to be polished. And what's most important is that they somehow articulate their thinking in writing. Translation work. This builds off the thinking through what Elliot Rabin's article shares in Tefillah as poetry, and I think this is important for many reasons. I'll detail those in a second. But the practice is this: that you would take a Tefillah, bracha, and you ask the students to translate it into their own words. And I would stress the practice of translation as a practice of kavanah. That is, the Siddur is a mirror for where we are at this moment. So it's not that they're trying to get the literal translation, but what they're trying to do in some sense is approximate how they feel about this bracha in the act of translation. And that's why it's important that you allow them some liberty in translating freely. You should stress that their translation should balance how they feel at this moment with the meaning of the words themselves. And to be honest, I found that so many students know so little about what the tefillot actually mean, even high school students who've been saying tefillot their entire lives, that you might actually want to offer not only a few examples of translations, but even some canonical translations. Photocopy the Quran, photocopy the art scroll, and show them how these tefillot are translated, and allow them to build off of that language in their own translations. Taking to an extreme, students can compile their own Siddurim this way, and I think that would be an incredible project to be realized in a day school. Tefillah as poetry. This builds off the translation work, and what it really does is ask students not only to think about tefillah in terms of translation and meaning, but also in terms of form. So what does tefillah look like on the page? Where does one pause? Where does one break one's lines? Where does one break one's phrases? Now this is kind of, again, it creates meaning because students oftentimes see Siddurim as just blocks of text, and they don't think about them as these beautiful parallel structures of poetry. It's obviously a great place. A great place to do this would be an obvious place to do this would be the Tehillim or Az Yashir, lots of Psukei de Zimra. But even if you ask students to translate brachot as poetry, you might find some surprising products in this way. Again, another great way to create a product for a student that the student would own as his or her own Siddur. And this, again, will encourage them to think through the form of tefillah. So there's a sort of functional piece here, not just a creative piece. This idea is entirely borrowed from Elliot Rabin's article that is required reading for this week. And the prayer journal. So the prayer journal is some sort of composition notebook where all these activities could be found. Maybe it would be kept in the Beit Knesset in your school. And a tefillah journal is useful for all of these activities, but in general, as a goal, for an educator, it would help you, and it would help the students mark progress in prayer. It would be a way in which students can write out their personal problems, either theological, faith-related, or even more personal problems than that. And if this becomes a kind of mentoring guide, if it becomes a way in which students come to certain kinds of realizations or certain articulations of certain challenges, then perhaps this would be a way for them to articulate those thoughts first in a way to themselves before they were to share that with a mentor or a guide. Okay, so we've discussed writing practices. I want to share with you a teaching from Rabbi Kook. This is from the Hakdama to Siddur Olat Riyah. This is the first page, second paragraph of the Hakdama, of the introduction to Siddur. And Rabbi Kook really kind of balances practice with sort of a mystical tradition, and I think that's what's so beautiful about this teaching in particular and its application for what follows. So I usually use this teaching to be totally open here. I use this teaching when I introduce meditation tefillah to students. So I show them Rav Kook sees tefillah as something that is not just something that happens when you open your mouth and when you have kavanah, but it's actually a process that is present in the universe always. So see what he says. Eina tefila ba'a kitikuna ki im mitoch hamachshava shebe'emet haneshama hi tamid mitpalelet. Tefillah is only wholesome when it arises from the idea that in truth the soul is always praying. And he goes on and on here, and I really recommend that you take a look at this teaching closely and take a look at the surrounding paragraphs, the first paragraph, the third paragraph of the Saktama. But this says it, this single sentence says it most succinctly, that within oneself, not beyond oneself, but within oneself, tefillah is always happening. It is, put simply, it is the activity of the soul. And if that's the case, then the activity of the person should be to quiet everything else happening around oneself, within oneself, so that the tefillah of the soul can be realized. And in fact, that's how I was introduced to this teaching. I was hearing a teaching from Rav Daniel Cohen, who's the Rav of Bat Ayin, the Yeshuv in Bat Ayin, and he shared this teaching, and he asked everybody to sit quietly for about 10 minutes and just listen. You know, sit quietly, listen to the prayer of your soul. And it was heartbreaking. It was totally mind-blowing to think through, you know, how have we never done this? Why have we never done this? And it totally challenged, for me at least, challenged the paradigm of what tefillah should and could be. So that took me to developing meditation tefillah, and I've led meditation tefillah here at SAR High School for the last year, every morning. And I recommend, just to get a sense of, you know, how I structured it and the text that I used and what students' reactions were and all of that, I recommend that you read the case study. It's about a 20-page case study that I wrote up last year after just a week of doing the meditation tefillah. I acted as a sort of ethnographer in my own classroom, in my own tefillah. So I recommend that you take a look at that. That's attached to this week's research unit. And I just want to talk through some of the practice components here. Maybe I'll post another video that would kind of expand on this, but I do think that tefillah, meditation tefillah, can be summed up in 4 steps here. And I always prompt students to do this before we actually do any kind of real tefillah. The first stage is in a sitting is posture, and what this means is upright sitting. This means that one is not slouching in one's chair, one is not, and again this assumes that students are in chairs, not on cushions or on the floor. They're sitting in chairs as they might otherwise, but they're not slouching, they're not leaning against anything, they're not leaning against even the backs of their chairs. They're firmly planted somewhere between the edges of their seats, so they're sitting somewhat on the edges of their seats and their feet are planted firmly on the ground. And their backs are entirely straight, their head is straight, their gaze is lowered, so they're not distracted by anything, but their eyes can remain open, and their hands are coming to rest because students like to fidget a lot, and as we all do, and so their hands are coming to rest on their knees. So their feet are firmly planted on the ground, their knees are about shoulder width apart, and they are somewhere balanced between their chairs and their feet. And with this upright sitting, I asked them to begin to notice their breath. So I asked them to notice that, and I asked them actually to close their mouths and notice their breath through their nose, to notice how their breath enters their nose and exits their nose, to notice how their bellies and chests expand with each breath, and to do this just for a few minutes and talk them through that. The next step really is to be mindful, and what that means simply is to be the watcher of one's thoughts, not to be the thinker. And so what this means is that as thoughts begin to arise, all sorts of resisting thoughts, especially for the first time meditator, a student is prompted to think through, a student is prompted to watch through all of those thoughts as they happen. So perhaps they are not just thoughts, they're raw emotions, they're resistances. So students are told and really talked through watching their thoughts as if they were clouds passing through their minds, as if they were a parade passing across their heads, just to watch the thoughts and see how they come and go and how they can't really be sustained without thinking the thoughts themselves. And then finally, taking this into a Jewish realm, into tefillah, I asked them to listen carefully to their neshama, whatever that means to the students. So ask them to listen to their ratzon. What is it that they want at this moment? What do they want from their lives, from the world, from God? And really to sit with that tefillah, if they can, for 5 minutes. I find that tefillah can be far more productive, even if this whole practice is done as an introduction to a standard tefillah. The same thing can be done with standing meditation. Students stand in a mountain pose. They stand still, hands at their side, feet shoulder width apart, and they practice bowing slowly, and then kind of arching their backs as they come back up as if they were snakes. Okay, this week's research will include a video by Rabbi Aaron. Watch it, it's incredible. In 5 minutes, he explains that tefillah is not prayer. Prayer means to beg. Begging is Latin for prayer. I'm sorry, prayer is begging for I'm sorry, I'm totally jumbled here. That's in some sense, prayer is not a Jewish practice because it means to ask for something, but tefillah, in fact, is not about asking, it's about orientation. Watch the videos about various approaches to tefillah, and then when you think about applying these practices, apply them, construct a tefillah model for your own school that's appropriate, and then finally discuss what you learned, what's useful for you, etc.